Thanks for your attention.
Scheduled for anything at 4, so I'm going to let Al make a brief response, and then we'll open up to the questions.
Well, I'd like to say first, I think I strongly suspect there is something in what I said that Dennett disagrees with, but I've been having a little difficulty in seeing just what it is. And I enjoyed the stories about the silly stories about Superman and the really nasty art critic and the like of that. I'm not so clear exactly as to how all this bears on what I had in mind and what I wanted to say. At first I thought, when I first read Dan's paper, I thought what he had in mind was something like this. We were asked to discuss the question whether science and religion are compatible. And I argued that they are, at least with respect to the particular point at issue about evolution. And then he agreed, but he goes on to say something like this, that there are lots of really silly propositions compatible with science, and theism is one of them. On further thought, though, it struck me maybe that's not really the structure of his argument. It wasn't that he was claiming that theism, although he does say at one point, he says, I myself cannot see any rational grounds for preferring his, that is my, theism over my, that is his, Supermanism. It occurred to me that probably he wasn't thinking about theism when he was comparing some hypothesis of mine to the silly stories about Superman and the like, but rather the thought that God guided and orchestrated, or rather my claim that it's possible that God could have guided and orchestrated the course of evolution. I wanted to argue that theism and Darwinism are compatible. I wanted to do so by providing some third proposition R, such that it's pretty clear that theism and Darwinism and R are all compatible, from which it would follow that theism and Darwinism are. And the R in question was this proposition: God guided and orchestrated the course of evolution to produce the kinds of creatures he wanted. Well, of course, then first of all, I'm not committed to the truth of this proposition. It's just another case of showing that a pair of propositions P and Q are compatible by finding some third proposition R, which is compatible with P and Q, and such as this, the conjunction of all three is possible, from which it follows that P and Q are. So I'm not committed to that proposition. But the fact is, I'm not committed to it, but maybe Dan's thinking something like this. That must be the only way. That's the only R in town. That must be the only way in which it could be that Darwinism and theism are compatible. And if that proposition is very implausible or has very low probability, then one can hold that Darwinism and theism are compatible only at the cost of believing something that's really improbable, really implausible. And perhaps he wanted to argue that this proposition, my R, is really implausible or improbable, by comparing it to his Supermanism. Now, I am inclined to think Supermanism is a relatively foolish proposition. I mean, that there should be something like a human-like being that can do that. I mean, we could go on and talk instead about, say, Dennettism, which would be the thought that Dan Dennett was actually there 500 million years ago and interfered in the course of evolution, intervened and brought it about that there should now be creatures of the sort there are human creatures and so on. I would consider that a really silly proposition too. But I can't see why either Supermanism or Dennettism is anything like the proposition that God has so intervened. The main reasons would be that we know perfectly well that human-like creatures and human beings don't live that long. Very few of them achieve an age of 500 million years, and furthermore, they're not capable of that kind of activity. So it seems to me there's really no, as far as I can see, there is no similarity between these two. By pointing out that Supermanism is a silly proposition, a silly belief thesis, it in no way follows that the suggestion that God has intervened in the course of evolution to produce the kinds of creatures he wants, in no way follows that that's silly at all. Just a couple more little points here. Dan says something like this. He says that, I can't seem to find this particular thing I'm looking for here. Hold on a second. Oh yeah. Dan claims that naturalism is tacitly assumed in all respectable or reputable courts of law and throughout scientific investigation. Now, if he's using the word naturalism the way I defined it in my paper, then this seems to me to be clearly false, to be obviously false. In physics, for example, it's not assumed that there is no such person as God. There are lots of theistic physicists. These physicists don't take it that in doing physics they have to assume there's no such person as God. Rather, what they think they are doing is exploring, explaining, discovering how this world, which in fact God has created, how it works. It may be that they will not produce hypotheses that directly entail the existence of God, but that's a totally different question. As for Michael Behe, let me say, I'll say only this. There's a lot to say on this head, but of course we don't have the time. Let me say only that my recollection of his visit to Notre Dame is very different from Dennett. Very different from Dennett. It does not seem to me, as I remember it, it's not at all the case that, I mean, he wasn't shown to be a charlatan, he wasn't shown to be mistaken, as I remember it. I thought he held his own very well with respect to Dennett and his friend. Dennett is right in suggesting that the creed I want to discredit is naturalism. That is, the creed I want to discredit in the evolutionary argument against naturalism, anyway, is naturalism. It's an argument against naturalism. But I must say I was disappointed in his response to my evolutionary argument against naturalism. He basically simply announces that evolution has in fact produced us, and that in fact our beliefs do track the truth. But that's not an issue at all. I do not mean for a minute to argue that evolution has not produced us, nor for a minute that our beliefs do not track the truth. That isn't the question. The question is rather whether what the probability that our faculties should be reliable is, given evolution and naturalism. I gave an argument for supposing that probability is low. It seems to me Dan didn't mention the argument.